Welcome to the Blue Yonder Overland Podcast. I'm your main host, Jen, and I started this podcast to inspire and empower you to spend more time outside, however works for you, but especially to make overlanding more approachable. Each week, we provide practical advice for vehicle-based camping, either focused on a topic or featuring interviews with people who are doing it, sharing lessons learned and empowering you to spend more nights under the stars. If you're new to overlanding, I'd recommend starting with our first 2 episodes on why we love it and how to find campsites beyond the campground. As always, feel free to send us any questions you have at BlueYonderGen at Instagram or Threads, and hopefully we'll see you out in the wild Blue Yonder. Hey everyone, welcome back for episode 7 of the Blue Yonder Overland Podcast. Today we're going to be discussing how to avoid common camping pitfalls, especially prepping for bad weather, and how to cope with bad conditions. I'm recording this episode from Southern California. We're actually in town for the Overland Expo Southern California first edition, which is taking place this weekend in Costa Mesa. And as I mentioned last week on the podcast, if you have any questions related to overlanding, there's going to be a wealth of information and experts, different rigs, people camping in all sorts of ways imaginable. So if you do have any questions, feel free to send them my way, and I will find somebody at the expo with the answers for us. It's actually quite rainy and cool here in Southern California this week, reminding us a bit of our Pacific Northwest home. So not quite what we expected for weather, which is actually a great segue into our topic for this week, where we're going to dive into all of the weather pitfalls that you might run into and how you can prep for those, when you might just need to rethink your camping location, and how you can make the best of bad conditions that arise once you're already at camp. I want you to close your eyes and imagine something for me for a minute. Imagine someone asks you to go camping with them for this weekend. You open the weather app on your phone and to double check what clothes that you'll need to pack and immediately think, it's going to be too blank to enjoy this camping weekend. What was that word that popped into your head, filling in that blank of, it's going to be just too... For us in the Pacific Northwest, it's often hot that would come to mind for that blank, or rainy. Those are the 2 big conditions that we don't really like to camp in. Ironically, it's usually not cold. We love camping in the cold and the winter, but if you're not used to it, that might be the word that pops to mind. I think this word is probably different for everyone, depending on where you live, what season you're in, what you've gotten comfortable with in terms of enjoying activities in the outdoors. So it's going to be a little different for everyone. I think oftentimes, though, the biggest things that can arise to really put a damper on a camping weekend are weather conditions. And so we'll discuss some of those most common ones. I'm thinking temperature, so too cold, too hot, too wet, stormy or windy. Perhaps it's muddy in the area that you're in, as well as maybe too noisy for sleeping. So if you are planning to be near a large campsite or maybe a really popular activity area, maybe you're worried about the noise. So we're going to discuss all of these common things that might make your camping adventure a little bit less enjoyable, ways that you can prep for it ahead of time, and how to mitigate it once you're at camp today. So without further ado, let's get the show on the road. Today, we're going to discuss topic by topic some of the common conditions that might make your camping trip just a little bit less enjoyable. I'll go through each topic. I'll talk about things that we try to always pack on hand, sort of a bare minimum that's part of our camping prep and pack list that could help mitigate this condition. And then I'll discuss extra things we might bring along just to maximize our comfort and enjoyment if it looks like the conditions will be especially extreme for whatever we're discussing. So I'm going to start with temperature extremes because I think this is a pretty common one that most of us can relate to. If it's just too hot or too cold, it might not only be uncomfortable, but it might be unsafe for camping. So let's start with things that we always pack as a bare minimum to help control temperature extremes of cold and hot. The most obvious way to mitigate cold and hot temperature extremes is, of course, firstly with clothing. So we always make sure we pack beanie hats, gloves, layers along in the car, no matter what we're taking. Especially with overlanding, it's just really easy to keep kind of a go bag of winter clothing and extra hats, gloves, etc., just on hand, especially throughout the winter season, even if it doesn't look particularly cold. But the other thing would be things like shorts and tank tops. So if it's getting into the shoulder season or summer, just making sure we pack those cool options as well. But we can also discuss camping equipment that we generally always have along in the truck or in our camping setup. So as I mentioned on one of the first 2 episodes, probably our favorite single piece of extra comfort camping gear to have along are our blankets called Mombies, which are really giant ponchos that have a plush lining and a waterproof lining on the outside. They have hoods, they have pockets, they have snap closures, and they're just amazing for being able to enjoy the campfire. But they can also double as an extra warm layer or waterproof layer for us. And they just roll up into bags that we keep in sort of a overhead netting in the back of the truck cab. So they're always there, always available to kind of help be that extra warm layer. And that's really useful even on nights in the summer that it seems like it's really hot during the day, but it can get really cold at night, especially if you're in the desert or the Pacific Northwest, where it just stays kind of moderate all year. And so that's just a great option to just always have on hand and can kind of help you get through. You could also throw it in your sleeping quarters if you need an extra blanket to stay warm at night. The other fun tip that we mentioned, I think this came up in the conversation with Alex Hager a couple of episodes ago, was always having a way on hand to boil water and then to be able to store it in something like an Nalgene bottle, which can add an extra bit of warmth for your sleeping bag or just being able to have tea on hand. Just another way of getting some warm, recently boiled water either in you or near you. It's a little bit harder, I think, to just have on hand things that might help mitigate when it's really hot out. But one thing is obviously having some way of maximizing airflow. So some sort of screen door, whether that's flaps that roll up on your tent or your rooftop tent or a screen door on your trailer, whatever your setup looks like, some way of being able to get airflow through 2 sides of your tent or sleeping enclosure. And that's pretty standard. I think then where we get into more interesting things is when we get into the season where we know it's likely to have more extremes of either cold or hot. The extra things we'll pack seasonally to help maximize our comfort, or if the temperature looks like it'll be extreme for that weekend. And for this, there's really a spectrum of ways you can mitigate this, all the way up to changing your whole camping setup, your camping platform. And we haven't really discussed vehicle platforms yet and strategies and kind of benefits, pros and cons of each. But obviously, some of the camping solutions like a van or a trailer are going to offer you a lot more insulation from both hot and cold extremes. And so that's one thing to consider when you're considering just your baseline camping setup. If you're not talking about changing your entire setup or upgrading your setup for something that'll be a little more versatile, then there's a lot of things you could bring along that'll still mitigate these things with your current setup. One of the most obvious is a heated blanket, especially if you're bringing along some sort of portable battery pack like a Jackery or some small battery. You could just plug that in overnight, and that just adds such a great level of comfort, especially if you turn it on just a little bit before you get into bed. Make it nice and warm for you to climb into. We've definitely used this both with a rooftop tent, but also in a trailer if we don't want to run the heat for some reason, or maybe we're trying to conserve our energy. Using a heated blanket can be a nice way to avoid having to heat the air around you. Of course, some sort of portable heater is another option, and we've actually used that for both our trailer and a rooftop tent as well. Matt actually rigged up a propane-powered heater that he was able to get an air duct sort of into our rooftop tent, and then a similar venting air duct out of it, and even rigged it up with little temperature control and a carbon monoxide alarm system as well. So there are a lot of options if you want to figure out how to add a heater. I know diesel powered heater is another option. Otherwise, other small portable like buddy heaters, like propane heaters, that's something that we've used before. And so there's a lot of solutions like that on the market. On the flip side, I think the solutions for managing if it's too hot out are a little bit harder to come by, because unless you have some sort of van or trailer with an AC unit attached, there's not a terrible lot you can do other than increasing airflow somehow, or planning ahead for extra water, or maybe having a shower set up or a way to kind of keep rags cool. So a battery powered fan is one that we have definitely used in our rooftop tent before. So coupled with opening all of the air flaps on the side for some airflow, a little fan that we could put overhead pointed directly at us to help keep airflow on us as we got to sleep really helped us get cool enough to actually fall asleep. And then, of course, it usually gets cooler overnight. So hopefully you can just stay asleep after that. But the other thing would be extra water, or, thinking through strategically with things like cloths that you can wring out, dip in cold water, and then kind of keep wrapped around your neck. We had to use this when we were actually showing our trailer at the Electrified Expo in Denver, and it was over 100 degrees all weekend long out on black asphalt for this exhibit. And luckily, the event organizers passed out these wringable sort of small pieces of cloth that you could use to dip in ice water and then wrap around your neck or over your head, add it sort of as over your hat to kind of keep a little bit of cooler airflow going over your head or around key body parts. So that's one solution. We honestly haven't found that many other good ones. The other one is just simply choosing a campsite strategically that could be a little cooler, either with some shade or near water, or maybe choosing to be lower along like a river valley versus up in a hot sun exposed spot. The other thing would be, of course, packing more awnings for shade. So we have a rollout awning on the side of our truck that we would often use as a place to kind of help shade our seating area, our kitchen prep area. But you could also pack a whole other tent just to be able to give you a little bit of extra shade during the day or for other activities. And I think those are really all the solutions that we've used to help mitigate extreme hot. Other than that, you also might just totally choose a different campsite. You might call an audible even on the way and decide to go somewhere where it's going to be a little bit less cold or hot if it's getting into extremes that you don't think you'll be able to mitigate with your current setup and equipment. After temperature, I think the next biggest worry that I often think about is whether it's going to be too wet or rainy. This was one of my main concerns going backpacking in the wilderness areas surrounding Olympic National Forest was, of course, it's wet a lot of the time until you get basically into July and August. It's really not guaranteed to be dry at any point. And so my biggest worry heading into that weekend was if I was going to end up wet and therefore probably cold and just be unable to get dried out. I figured that would really sour me on backpacking. So one of the solutions that our guides provided for us was these giant, very thick, durable trash bags to line the inside of our backpack. And I've just kept mine in there. It's such thick, heavy duty plastic, not like a normal garbage bag. It was definitely like an extra tough, durable one. And that's been such a great liner. And I actually pulled it out when me and my sister went backpacking in the Rocky Mountains last summer, and we ran into some unexpected rainstorms, and she did not have a good waterproof jacket along. So I pulled that out of my backpack and we used that as a little sort of waterproof cape for her, making do with what we had on hand to help mitigate it. And I was so glad that I still had that packed. So simple things like that, where it's really easy to add that into your camp setup or your prep, or just stick it in a box somewhere, extra waterproof lining of any kind, even like I said, a trash bag, could really help to mitigate unexpected situations. We also always pack waterproof jackets if we're going overlanding for sure, and we've got that room. It's nice as a little bit different than backpacking where you really have to worry about extra things. But with overlanding, you do have that freedom to make sure you've got a waterproof shell or liner packed along in your vehicle. So we always have one in there. Bonus points if you also have waterproof shoes and pants packed along. Depending on where you're going, especially in the Pacific Northwest, it's just kind of a good practice to also have head to toe waterproof gear along. Can really help mitigate those wet situations. We also always travel with towels, and so that's useful for mopping up anything that does happen, getting yourself dried off before you change into dry clothes. And so we always have towels packed. And then if we suspect that there's definitely rain in the forecast, or we're just in kind of the midst of rainy season, we'll bring along some extra things. And so this is where if you've got a tent or a rooftop that has an extra rain fly or awning attachment, we'll always make sure to pack that rain fly along. And we might choose to pack extra towels or extra tents. And also just additional ways to dry things out. So whether that's towels, heaters, anything that like a dryer or a fan that can kind of help to dry things out. We use all of these things on my very first camping trip to Orcas Island in Washington. And it was in, it would have been late October, because after, I believe it's October 15th, they open up all of the hiking trails for mountain biking up in Orcas Island. And so it had become sort of a semi-annual trip for my husband, Matt, and his friends to go up there in the fall and in the spring before it switched over to pedestrian only, hiking only on the trails for the summer. And so what this often meant was in that shoulder season, you really couldn't plan for the weather and you might be in for a very wet trip, which is what happened on my first trip with them to Orcas Island. It was so wet, so rainy all weekend long. And luckily we had brought all of the things we could think of to help mitigate this. So it ended up looking a bit like a tent city set up between the two pickup trucks that we had. Our friends were in their trailer, so they were extra warm and dry. We were in our rooftop tent with our rainfly, which stayed shockingly dry. Shout out to Bush Company tents. They are awesome. And we really never had a problem with water getting into our tent, even in pretty extreme conditions. And then we set up extra tents between our two awnings on our trucks so that we could kind of go between camp cooking and kitchen prep and eating, and also have a place to dry out all of the clothes we were wearing each day for mountain biking that just got soaked, and hopefully get them a little bit warmer and drying out in front of portable heaters or fans under these tents. And so it was like every day, just this struggle to get back to a baseline of dry. We also definitely made use of our propane fire pits, and I think our friend had a solo stove along for wood burning fire as well. And so between that and all of the tents, we were able to keep as warm and dry as we could and make the best of a very rainy weekend. And it actually ended up being a really, really fun trip that sold me on camping at Orcas Island and showed me that we didn't need to let a forecast for very bad rain get in the way of an awesome camping trip. After controlling for temperature or mitigating for what might be a wet camping weekend, I think the next thing on my mind is usually whether it's going to be stormy or windy. And obviously, if it's super stormy and depending on what type of storm, that might just mean a change in plans altogether. And this is one reason why we really like the flexibility of dispersed camping, because then we're not out any camping fees or reservation fees or change fees if we do decide to call a last minute change and head in a different direction, especially if you live in an area like around the Pacific Northwest, or as we discovered in Denver, where there can really be a lot of microclimates and you might travel just 20, 30 minutes in one direction and find very different conditions for camping. It was something that we learned to be aware of, especially as I got comfortable hiking in the Pacific Northwest. I found, if I had a choice of going 1 hour in one direction or 1 hour in a different, that might mean the difference between a sunny hike and a very wet hike or a windy hike or a stormy hike. So that is one of the few conditions where oftentimes there's not a lot you can do to mitigate it. And similar with wind, we use an app called Windy to try to get the wind forecast and then compare that with any other data we can find online about wind and wind forecasts. But that's one where oftentimes forecasts are really hard to get right about wind. And if we're trying to optimize for having a good campsite, we've got a great one, for instance, out by Leavenworth, Washington, that's up on a ridge. It's gorgeous, but if there's a wind, you're probably wishing you weren't there. And same with, we just had an experience in New Mexico, camping by a lovely reservoir park area, so right on a beach. And the wind had been predicted to die down after 5 p.m., but it took until 8 p.m. And so it meant that we were cooking dinner in blowing sand and then forced to retreat to trailers to eat the dinner and didn't really get much of a chance to socialize, which was kind of a bummer. And then luckily it did die down as we all went to bed. And so we were able to sort of open our trailer doors and hear the lapping of the waves and the much gentler breeze throughout the night, which was gorgeous. But again, just kind of highlighted how unpredictable it is with trying to plan and mitigate windy conditions. So things that we always pack along as a bare minimum to try to help with that would be some sort of windbreaker layer. Obviously, this is usually waterproof as well, so it goes back to having that waterproof shell along. We'll also bring along, as sort of standard part of equipment, stakes to tie down any awnings that we might have that roll out like from the truck, or tent awnings if we're bringing tents with us. Just stakes to make sure we get those anchored well. We had a rude awakening even just on a nice summer day camping near Mount Rainier in Washington, where we had a sort of sunshade tent set up, and it wasn't windy at all. But we had, I think, rocks in the corners or something to sort of anchor down each corner, but we hadn't done a very thorough job of anchoring it with stakes. And we came back from a short run and found that the tent tried to blow away halfway down the hill. So Matt had to chase it down and get it back. And it did end up having a tear in it, which then we had to try to repair with, I think we had duct tape along that we used to try to keep bugs out. That was our big thing we were mitigating against on that trip. But it was kind of a lesson learned as well to just always take that extra precaution and tie it down with the stakes that we always have with us anyway, just to avoid any unexpected gusts. But really, wind was the one big thing we found with the rooftop tent, and there just wasn't a lot we could do to mitigate it. We did a lot to mitigate as well, just any extra noise, because that's often the complaint with tents, with rooftop tents or ground tents, is that then if it's windy, it can also just be really loud with the flapping of the extra fabric. And so one thing that annoyed us at first was all of the metal, the really heavy duty metal zippers on a rooftop tent. So we actually removed all of the giant sort of metal tags that hung from the zipper component, and we put in really thin paracord. That was, I think it also had maybe a glow in the dark fabric strand in it as well, and just made our own little paracord fabric loops for each of the zippers instead of having metal zipper pulls. And it was hilarious how much that decreased the noise on our rooftop tent. And that's something you could do for any tent if you know you're going to be camping in windy conditions frequently and want to try to mitigate the noise as much as possible. But the other big thing that it impacts, in addition to tents or sleeping conditions, is cooking. And so if you don't have a good windscreen built into whatever your camp cook stove or cooking equipment is, that's something to think about too. If it is likely to be windy, think about how you can form a windscreen, either with equipment that you already have, the way you park your vehicles or set up your tents, or even just having extra things along like cardboard or someone willing to stand in front of to kind of block the wind from your cooking setup. But that's where cooking with propane can be so dependent on the wind. And one thing that we've really enjoyed switching to an induction cooktop stove with our slide out kitchen now in our trailer, that just takes away any of the headaches over wind while you're cooking altogether, because it's induction, totally not dependent on a flame or controlling that flame to cook your food. So that's been awesome. It's also wind and windy conditions are honestly one of the reasons that we wanted to move in the direction of getting a trailer or a van or something that was more enclosed, harder cased than a rooftop tent. And so this is something longer term you might want to think about too. If it's something that you're going to be doing frequently and you find yourself loving overlanding, it's one of those things you might want to consider for your setups long term, is moving in the direction that'll allow you to just take care of that worry altogether. So having something hard-sided, there's not very many hard-sided rooftop tents, although I have seen a few pop up on the market, but especially with vans or trailers, then obviously that mitigates a lot of the wind's impact. After wind, if we're thinking about storms and mitigations that you might need to bring along to deal with a storm or the aftermath, the other thing that we've encountered before that we weren't very well prepared for was mud. And so in the Pacific Northwest, things have generally drained pretty well. If something gets kind of extra rain and flooded, you might just not be able to get through that area altogether. But what doesn't happen is it doesn't pack your wheels like the mud that we encountered in northern Arizona in November. And we'll circle back to muddy roads when we discuss more about recovery and emergencies in a future episode. But we really learned the hard way that we were very unprepared to deal with how this mud acted. It was very different than Pacific Northwest mud, which is just very wet, but it's easy to wipe off, drains off, and doesn't pack itself. But the mud in Northern California did end up packing into our wheels. It would pack into the soles of your boots. It would stick to your boots or whatever shoes you were wearing. It stuck to everything. So we ended up buying some really stiff cleaning brushes as well as some extra rags to kind of help brush the mud off as it dried, and then had to be patient to help, just have it dry off a little bit. And then the other thing that we did was used recycled paper bags or cardboard pieces that we had lying around. This is where our habit of eating too much pizza really comes in handy, because we generally always have a pizza box around. But using paper bags or cardboard as just additional liners for the front of the truck cab or right outside where we were going to be sleeping to set our shoes on, so that we avoided tracking that really thick mud everywhere. And that was kind of helpful. I'd be curious to hear, though, from anyone who's even more familiar camping in potentially muddy conditions, if they've got other tips up their sleeve. And that's something I might ask about at the folks that we encounter at Overland Expo this weekend. After all of these factors related to some sort of weather conditions or dealing with the aftermath of those weather conditions, the other big dynamic that comes to mind for me is the noise level. I am one of the lightest sleepers you'll ever encounter. I also am very sensitive hearing wise, so I will often turn volume down lower than what other people want for listening on the TV or to music in the car. Like once you turn the dial just a little way up, I'm like, okay, that's good. We're good. We don't need it any louder. And I'm often shocked by how loud other people will listen to things. And so I quickly learned, camping in a rooftop tent especially, any noises, whether it was late at night or starting pre-dawn with the lovely wild birds in the area, I would get unreasonably upset with them for interrupting my sleep, and then I'd be unable to get back to sleep in those early morning pre-dawn hours. And so I started just always packing along a pair of foam earplugs or earplugs that were easy to insert. We also found moldable, they're made out of silicone earplugs. And these are even better than foam earplugs because they just stay in place and in shape longer. and don't pop out. I got really annoyed by foam earplugs popping out of my tiny little ears. So silicone moldable ones were really great. But then Matt did me one better. And for one of my birthdays or Christmas, I forget exactly when, he found these little white noise Bose earbuds that come with their own little chargeable case. And then it has its own little app, which I was annoyed at having to download another app, but that's beside the point. And it provides a range of different white noises you can choose based on your preferences. And as long as you have that downloaded ahead of time, the repeatable loop sound that you want to listen to, then you can use those overnight. And they're super comfortable. They've got a couple different sizes that you can switch out on the actual earbud itself. And so I use that especially if we're going to be in a campground and I am anticipating that my habits of waking and sleeping might be slightly different than everyone around me, then I'll make sure I pack my little Bose earbuds along. Matt uses a similar strategy where he oftentimes has trouble relaxing, shutting his mind off, falling asleep. And so sometimes we'll want to download one of his favorite shows and listen to that as he falls asleep as a soundtrack that he doesn't really have to think about. And so he'll just use his AirPod or AirBuds, whatever they're called, pair with his iPhone for listening to a show that he's downloaded and to be sure he gets to sleep. So those are some of my favorite tips and tricks for sleeping in a more quiet environment that I need to get that sleep. I'd be curious if you've got any other tricks for mitigating noise, especially around campgrounds. But honestly, that's also another reason why we live dispersed camping or overlanding so much, is that I think it mitigates a lot of that. Usually you are able to find quieter campsites. It's also one of the reasons why we have loved discovering campsites that are near any sort of running water, because that makes a fantastic soundtrack to sleep to if you've got a little river flowing next to you. We found a couple great ones in Colorado, up along Highway 14, coming out of Fort Collins. There's several river and creeks up there, and you can find some dispersed camping as well as campgrounds along a lot of those water spots. And that's just a beautiful, peaceful setting to be able to sleep to under the stars. Those are all the biggest conditions that pop up in my mind if I'm thinking about what might make me enjoy a camping weekend a lot less. Like, it's going to be too hot, cold, windy, rainy, stormy, muddy, noisy. Did I forget anything? Was there anything that popped into your mind? If I did, feel free to shoot me a message, Blue Yonder Jen on Instagram or Threads, or comment on Blue Yonder Adventures at Instagram. I'll be doing some posts of some of our mitigation strategies there and includes more behind the scenes. So if I did forget anything, let me know. I'd love to hear it. And if you've come up with any strategies for mitigating these conditions, I want to end with one just piece of advice regarding mindset that I think has helped us deal with any of these problems as they pop up on camp trips. So obviously, it's awesome if you can pack and prep for these things ahead of time. But especially if you go out for a longer trip, or if you're in an area or a season where the weather is changing frequently and unexpectedly, I'm thinking of shoulder seasons or maybe traveling between states or different environments where you're going to encounter just a lot of conditions that you might not be able to plan for, then a lot of it comes down to creative problem solving with whatever you happen to have on hand. Obviously, this can also be helped if you have done a good job of packing and prepping and having things on hand that lend themselves to problem solving. So I mentioned having a really heavy duty, durable trash bag that's waterproof. It could be a liner for a bag or serve as an extra waterproof cape if you need it. Something like that is just fantastic to have along because it can solve so many different problems. I feel similarly about duct tape. It can solve almost any problem that we have. But think about those things that another thing that pops into my mind is either magnets or Velcro straps or other sort of adjustable straps like a ratchet strap or paracord. That might be super useful for being able to rig up a little extra rain shelter or shade shelter if it's hot out, but can often lend itself to some creative problem solving on the go And so it's never a bad idea to have those very versatile items with you to be able to come up with solutions on the fly. But then it goes beyond just having some of these versatile items with you. You have to actually also have the mindset of thinking creatively about the problem that you're encountering and how you might try to solve it. I've seen this happen even in staying at friends' houses or staying in hotels, hostels, all sorts of accommodations as I've traveled around the world and had to deal with drastically different conditions. What comes to mind for me as one of the most uncomfortable sleeping conditions I've ever had to deal with was traveling to visit one of our field offices in northern Uganda, staying at a guest house run by a local woman. So it had, I think, about 5 or 6 different guest rooms, some shared bathrooms, and I believe that there was an AC unit out in the main eating living area, the kitchen, where we had breakfast or dinner. But then in the bedrooms, there was not any AC units. And I think a fan was provided, but it didn't work. There was mosquito netting because you always had mosquito netting around your beds in Uganda. But as I was able to get to sleep, it was hotter than I like to sleep. So I was sleeping in tank top and shorts, bare minimum, not under the covers at all, had my mosquito netting around my bed. But then during the night, woke up just sweating hot and also discovered that there were holes in the mosquito netting. And so that was where I not only had to try to have a creative mindset to solve the problems, but also then had to have the mental discipline to just calm myself down once I had done everything I could to mitigate things. I had discovered where the biggest holes were in the netting. I had kind of shoved those under the mattress, so it trying to mitigate exactly where it was covered, or I had put the extra pillow on the bed propped up against one side of the netting to kind of help block the hole that I had found. I had sipped water. I had made sure I got my hair up out of my face and off my neck, tried changing up my sleeping position, and also poured some water like on my hands and kind of rubbed it on my arms and legs to help sort of cool myself off, basically mimicking what sweat does for the body. So I tried all of these things. And so part of it was creative problem solving. And then part of it was like, okay, recognizing I have done everything to mitigate this. Now I need to take some deep breaths and try to focus maybe on my breathing for a little bit, focus on something that's going to take my focus away from these physical discomforts or problems like the bug bites that I had just gotten from the mosquitoes that got through the netting, and just try to relax and calm my mind down, get it off of the annoying mosquito bites or how hot it was, and try to get back to a relaxed state where I could fall asleep again. And I was eventually, I think it took me a couple hours, but I did eventually get back to sleep. It wasn't a great night, but it definitely taught me a lot about just always having that mindset of how I can solve my problems, because there's not always going to be somebody who can help fix them for you. You know, if you're staying at a hotel, sure, maybe you call the front desk about the broken AC unit or the fact that there's a hole in the screen or whatever the problem is. But a lot of times there's not going to be anybody who's better equipped to solve your problems than you. It just takes a creative mindset and embracing whatever materials you have around you. But then also at the end of the day, recognizing when you've done all you can and you just have to figure out a way to endure and relax as much as you can to get through it. And so that's where I really think, like so many of these topics that we're discussing in overlanding and camping, mindset plays such a big role in helping you enjoy it and helping you look on it as a journey of discovery and adventure, and also helping you to be able to focus on the good things about the experience and be able to creatively look at problems that you can solve, ways that you can be more comfortable, and then at the end of the day to just try to focus on the good as best you can. So that's my biggest piece of advice and my takeaway from all the different camping, sleeping environments that I found myself in is, one, to just always take that personal responsibility for trying to fix my own problems as much as I can and think creatively about the materials I've got with me. And then 2, practice that mindfulness and focusing on the positive to make sure that I can actually get a good night's sleep in whatever the situation is. So I'll leave you with that. I'm sure you all can relate with situations that you've been in. And so if you do have a great camping or traveling story where it was not ideal conditions and what you did to make it work, I would love to hear that. I think those are such interesting stories, and we always end up learning something or learning a new fun little creative hack that might be helpful for other people trying to get a good night's sleep in a similar situation. So feel free to send those my way, send any comments my way. I love those type of stories. Thanks for joining us today. If you did stick around all the way to the end, thank you so much. I would love it if you would hit like or subscribe, whatever makes sense on your platform of choice for listening to podcasts. That'd be super appreciated. And feel free to double check Blue Yonder Adventures at Instagram for some additional behind the scenes photos and any video clips I find from Overland Expo about creative ways that other people have solved these exact same problems and getting more enjoyment out of their camping nights. So I will be posting anything I find at the expo this weekend to Blue Yonder Adventures at Instagram or Blue Yonder Jen at Instagram or Threads. Sometimes I like more commenting via text, and so Threads has been really great to connect with similar adventurers and travelers and outdoor enthusiasts and podcasters, and to see kind of what's going on behind the scenes and the thoughts behind the scenes. So I'll be posting some extra content there. If I get really ambitious, I'll also post any extra behind the scenes video content to Blue Yonder Overland on YouTube. If I find time for editing, we'll be in the midst of transiting from LA all the way up to Kingston, Washington next week, headed back to our house up in Kingston. And so lots of days of driving and long days on the road, trying to take advantage of some of the beautiful scenery and parks along the way. So we'll see what I end up being able to post. But at the very least, there'll be another podcast episode next Thursday. Thank you so much for tuning in.